The spike protein is controversial, not because of the science, but because of what it represents. And this is where we're getting stuck at the moment, because there are a lot of people who are struggling with problems around the spike protein. And I'm going to be sharing with you a case study. This is somebody who shared their experience on Twitter. And so I took the time to go through it. It's a guy called Kenny Carmody. And so I just studied everything that he had put on his Twitter page and used it to build a case as to the challenge that exists for many people in the population. And this is why I went about building a spike reset or detox course. Now, depending on where you are in terms of your scientific perspective, the minute I say detox, people get very wary. But you have to listen carefully to what I'm talking about, because this took me some time to put together. If you look at this, I mean, this has been one heck of a journey trying to get all of these patterns together. Additionally, when I look at the fact that there are some people out there, so say for instance with Medicinals 9 and Molecusan and Joachim Gerlach, who is working on spike removal with specific products and measuring the presence of spike protein, we know that this is an issue. But it's important to understand why many people don't like to talk about spike protein. And the truth is that, in some senses, what I've created here, I think that I'm going to have to rename so that some people can see it. Because the minute you say spike and you say detox, it raises red flags, and some people don't like to think about it. It's kind of like talking about tetanus. Tetanus, the bacteria, is not really the problem. It produces a toxin that can then cause neuromuscular damage. And this is why we do tetanus vaccination. So we're targeting the specific toxin, so to speak. It's kind of like talking about tetanus as the bacteria and not really focusing on the part of the bacteria that really causes pathology. Same with diphtheria. Diphtheria is a known bacteria, but not all strains of it produce the toxin. The toxin producing strains are really where the damage is. It's same with streptococcus and staphylococcus. All of these situations, there is a specific product that drives the pathology. The problem is when we come to the pandemic, we have a problem talking about the spike protein. This is a virus, and you can see, if I went up here, this is the structure of the coronavirus. It's like a football with spike proteins on the surface. These can bind to a cell and enter it. But it's not just a spike protein on the surface. There is a membrane protein here. There's an envelope protein. And on the inside, you have nucleocapsid proteins. And you have lots of ORF and NSP proteins that are produced when the virus gets into the cell. But here is the question. Which one of these is the most likely driver of the cytokine storm and the pathology around COVID? Everything points to the spike protein. Now, here's the problem. If you say that, you immediately get targeted because it sounds like what you're saying is anti-vaccine, because just coincidentally, they use the same spike protein to try and drive immunity, kind of like what you would do with tetanus and the toxide. The problem is they didn't fully understand how this spike protein causes so much pathology. So their instinct was right. The execution, however, was a problem. Whichever way we take it, this spike protein is very, very sticky. I call it like Velcro. It just sticks to anything it hits. And there are so many proteins that are part of the problem. And in this case study, I'll be talking about another protein that I didn't even know about. And I thought to myself, this is too important. Structure of SARS-CoV-2 spike in complex with its co-receptor, the neuronal cell adhesion protein contactin 1. Another protein that this as to what happens, you will then begin to realize why taking care and understanding about the spike protein is such a critical bit of strategy. And whichever way you take it, when you look at this paper, I use this paper as a template because it's so important. Spike protein persistence of spike protein in the skull and meninges brain axis. When they did this in the rat model and they injected the spike protein, it goes everywhere. Not only that, it persisted. This is specifically what this paper was looking at. It persisted in the skull and the meninges. So anyone who says that it doesn't persist or it's not a problem, they need to go and look at this paper. Persistence of spike protein at the skull and meninges brain axis may contribute to the neurological sequelae of COVID-19. There is no getting around it. This is some sticky stuff. The problem is how do you get rid of it? And this is where some products, as we've mentioned before, you'll hear about spike detox protocols that are quite generic. As I said, medicinals and molecusan do a very clear strategy with regards to getting it out of immune cells, and they can measure it. So there is clear strategies about it. But what my focus has been on is the fact that this is exceptionally complex, and not everybody responds to straightforward approaches. And so this is why I started to look at how do you help people to not just get rid of spike protein, but reduce their risk on further exposure. That's really where I am developing these systems. Not just about getting rid of the spike, because when the reinfection happens again, you can have the same thing occurring. So my view is deal with the embers, then clear out the spike. This is where the products come in. And then hopefully long-term strategy to maintain it. And this is why I said this is a complex process that I couldn't figure out any easy way to do. And this is why this is over about 8 to 9 weeks of looking at how you strategize to get rid of this. So that's for people who are interested. You just click on the link. Part of the problem is that you've been fighting spike protein with the wrong strategy. Go here, take a look at what I'm saying here and make up your mind as to this, whether or not this is relevant for you. But here is the case presentation that I want to bring to you, just to show you the complexity of what we're dealing with. So what we have is somebody who shared publicly on their profile. Now, you have to remember, this is not a case report where it's been publicly clarified and the research boxes has been ticked. We are just listening to an individual sharing their journey and their story. I have no reason to presume that they are necessarily hiding anything or making up anything, so I would trust what they are saying generally. And this guy says for the past 5 years, he had been fighting for his life after one Moderna COVID vaccine in July 2021 triggered a cytokine storm and unleashed a rare neuromuscular disease, left him 80% bedridden. So this is the kind of overview. I've taken the time to go through everything that he has said. You know, look at this. Every day he has stroke-like attacks. He has problems with his swallowing, sinus swelling, whole body pain. I mean, this is somebody who has been seriously injured because of the spike protein. People have told him it's in his head. They've called him schizophrenic, depressed, everything that they could, and they will not easily get answers. So this is the case that I am talking about when you think about people who are really affected by this. Now, here is an important point, just in case some people say this is only related to the vaccine. That's not true. There are a lot of people who just infection will cause this kind of pattern. And where I'm very concerned are the cohorts of people who get this sometimes not after vaccination, but after an infection when they'd previously been vaccinated. So the immune priming, and they then end up with long-term symptoms. This is occurring all the time, and many people don't even realize it. So let's take a look at what it is that this guy had. And I'll take you through step by step so that you understand how complex this is. So I have here the whole timeline. So prior to July 2021, this guy was no prior reported COVID illness, peak health, very fit, high activity, travel demanding work. Now, one of the first things that I say to people is just because you had no prior obvious symptoms doesn't mean you didn't have an inflammatory focus, an ember. And the reality is with spike protein, it's like spraying petrol on the embers of fire. And when I talk with patients and I dig through their history, invariably I find the trigger points where those embers are. And the problem then is, how do you address it? Because there are no simple solutions to doing it. So let's look again at what he then experienced. So he documented that he had a single Moderna vaccine in the July, and immediately he felt a sensation of poison in the body, immediate signal, and his life changed at that point. And so within 3 days, he had burning in his joints, muscles, organs, nervous system shut down. He ended up in intensive care for 6 weeks. Tried a lot of things, no clear trigger beyond this. Now, some people will say that you don't know if it was the vaccine. Now, when we do clinical medicine, if I give you penicillin and you come out with a rash all over your body, I can't prove it was the penicillin, but the temporal connection makes it very likely that you are allergic to penicillin. So if someone becomes unwell within 24 hours and then severely unwell within a few days, needing intensive care from having a vaccine, unless you can find some other reason, that has got to be the most likely diagnosis. Okay. So as I said, some people will ignore him because they'll say, well, you don't know if it was that. Come on, guys. You can't be serious as a clinician and say something like that. But anyway, let's move on. The critical point that stood out to me here was the fact that he had symptoms within 3 days. Okay. Now, that to me suggests his immune system was somehow primed, because he then went on to have progressive neuromuscular symptoms. As we said, a lot of neurology, stroke-like spasms, dysphasia, breathing issues, couldn't get back to work. He spent over $60,000 on interventions, didn't quite work. And he represents, in my view, the kind of really complex patient for which there are no simple answers. And I wouldn't say to this guy that he can just get better. This is way more complex than that. And so when I followed it along, and as I say, I have the time frame from what he has shared, in the ongoing chronic state, persistent spasms, still 80% bedridden. Can you imagine that? Fluctuating chronic symptoms, stroke-like episodes, fatigue. This is pretty serious stuff. He even had apheresis done where they try and remove the antibodies. He had a point here, I remember seeing that his amount of his antibody, look at this, his spike protein antibody level, 12,500, after almost 4 years. Now, just to get it in context, if someone gets COVID, the normal spike antibody level is about 280 to 300. His was 12,500 after 4 to 5 years. This suggests some degree of ongoing spike persistence. The problem is there is no easy way to get it out. Now, The reason why I emphasize these cases is because it forces you to think outside the box. And in his case, there was an important thing that caused me to think outside the box. And it was the fact that he had symptoms within hours, within days, he was in intensive care. So that got me to thinking, how in the world is that possible without some degree of pre-priming of his immune system? So I then went looking through for what proteins could trigger something like this within such a short period of time. And this is where I stumbled into this preprint paper. This has not even yet been published. Structure of SARS-CoV-2 spike in complex with co-receptor neuronal cell adhesion protein contactin 1. This was done in the Netherlands. And what they found in this paper here was essentially that another protein that spike gets attached to is contactin 1, CNTN1. This protein is very much associated with the synapses and the way how synapses communicate with each other. So if this guy had a pre-existing priming of his immune system, and you would find it, I would bet that at some point in his history, this guy had some neurological issue, and whether it was post-infection or whatever it is, when you really dig, you're going to find that he had been sick at some point in his past. He had recovered, but the trigger point was still present, that autoimmune response remained intact. And this is what I suspect then led to the reactivation of an autoimmune issue. I need to show you an image, and I'm going to have to find it, and I can't think of where I've got it. Trying to think about where I can show you this image, because this is the template of what I look at when it comes to understanding the spike exposure and spike protein issues. Where would I have this? I think that I did this in a presentation recently, so I'm taking a few minutes. But essentially, what I found was that at the center of all of this was the macrophage in terms of the spike protein response. And if you don't address that inflammatory process with this macrophage, you end up in a cycle of ongoing inflammatory processes. And that's essentially what I looked at. So in his case, if you had the macrophage at the center, it was primed. So he was already pre-primed for an immune response. And I'm betting when I looked at all the proteins that could cause this, his specific situation with regards to the neuromuscular patterns, the weakness, all of that neurology, the standout protein was contactin 1. And the point is, because it binds to spike protein, if his immune system picks up spike protein with contactin 1 bound to it, it will trigger almost like an anaphylactic kind of immune response. And when you think about what happened to him, he ended up in an intensive care within 3 days and was unwell after that. The problem is that when you then look at how the immune system responds subsequently, that's when we then have the challenge long term. Because as I said, once the immune system has been primed, this response is sitting there all the time, and anything that triggers it is going to reactivate the neurology. And this is what I have found when I look at so many patients, is that if they don't address those triggers that can potentially cause this, they end up in a cycle where they just never get better. And as I said, there is no easy way to resolve it. And truthfully, even in terms of my strategy with the spike, the detox approach, where you're looking at the gut and you're trying to resolve that. His case may be too complex for that. And this is part of what you're trying to tease out. There's some people who are too complicated to be able to be managed easily with either a simple therapy or even a simple protocol, because their immune system has been changed in such a way that it is a long-term injury that they have. Because I can't find my image, I'm going to have to explain it to you. What I was looking at was the choroid plexus and choroid plexus inflammation. And I think it's so difficult to explain without an image. So I'm going to find that image and show it to you here. But part of what I looked at is that there were four primary areas: the gut, the vascular, the vagal, and then the choroid plexus. And specifically, when I say choroid plexus, I mean fourth ventricle choroid plexus. And this was the driver for the majority of symptoms that people could have. And in his case, I would bet that a big part of his problem is to do with choroid plexus inflammation. So I've finally found it here. So I'm going to show you what the image looks like so that you can understand what I'm talking about here. Is So as I said, the choroid plexus is part of the brain and it helps the fluid to be produced around the brain. And the part of the brain that I've been focused on was this part here, choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle. This is the brain stem, and the choroid plexus would literally be sitting right here. And in his case, I would bet that he has choroid plexus inflammation, and that inflammation is driving inflammation in his brain stem. His brain would be sitting on top here. This part would be inflamed going down to the spinal cord. And if you don't address this part of the inflammatory process, they just can't get better. This is the central bit. In his case, it probably is mainly concentrated with activated macrophages sitting in the neuronal part of his brain. And because he seemed to have an autoimmune response, what's happening is he's having overactive autoantibody production on top of that. So he has two main things. The big question I would have with him is whether or not he has ongoing gut inflammation driving the whole process. And that's why whenever I look at these cases, I always start here. And everything about what I do is to exclude the gut in this picture. These are extremely complex cases. As I said, there is no easy solution for them. And where he is at the moment, when I show you what he has shared, he at the moment, I make this full screen, is in March 2026, no new triggers. He still has severe chronic symptoms, no full recovery, still 80% bedridden. He's still struggling with certain environmental things. Multiple interventions have failed, ongoing chronic relapses, and he will find that any trigger will cause a relapse in his symptoms. This is an example of the extreme complex cases. So he's at the far end of the complexity of this kind of presentation. But the principle is there are many people who are at much lower levels of complexity and they still need help. As I said, this has been a long journey. It took me a while to finally put this together, but I did. As I said, if you're interested, just look at the links below. This is going over about 8 to 9 weeks of ongoing strategy to work out and to help people to get beyond their struggles. And as I said, there is never a guarantee in this, but I am absolutely sure that if anyone has gut issues, your minimum is to address them and to see how much improvement you get, because invariably the gut is a central part of driving these symptoms. This was a lot of information condensed in one thing, looking at a specific case. But yes, this is important information. If you are interested, please take a look in the description below. And also remember, coming up, we're covering toxic liver disease rising across every age group. This is our next webinar. If you're interested, look at that. All of these things are relevant, but yes, there is still a lot more work to be done. Have a great evening.